Welcome to Daily English Room. Today's topic is books. Do you enjoy reading books?
Yes, I really enjoy reading, especially since it helps me improve my English. I spend a lot of time reading technical documentation for work, but I also try to read fiction to relax.
Absolutely. Reading has become even more important to me since having children. I read both for my professional development and to find good stories to share with my kids.
Yes, though I must admit I'm more of a practical reader. I love browsing through cookbooks and food-related literature. It's both entertaining and helpful for my career.
Yes, I love reading. It's actually how I started learning English seriously, through manga translations and then moving on to novels and design books.
Definitely. In my line of work as a tour guide, reading helps me gather interesting facts and stories about different places. Plus, I love reading about outdoor adventures.
Oh yes, I'm an avid reader. As a university student, I read both for my studies and for pleasure. Reading helps me understand different perspectives on environmental issues.
What kind of books do you usually read?
I mainly read technology-related books and science fiction. Authors like Liu Cixin have really inspired me to explore more sci-fi literature in both Chinese and English.
I read a lot of children's books in English to help with my teaching and parenting. I also enjoy educational books about bilingual development and teaching methodologies.
Besides cookbooks, I really enjoy food memoirs and books about different culinary cultures. I'm currently reading Anthony Bourdain's works to improve my English while learning about kitchen life.
I read a lot of design books and art magazines for work. For pleasure, I enjoy contemporary fiction and graphic novels. I find the visual storytelling really inspiring for my work.
I mostly read travel literature, books about local history, and adventure stories. Bill Bryson is one of my favorite authors. He combines humor with great travel writing.
I read a lot of environmental science textbooks and journals for my studies, but I also enjoy African literature and books about climate activism. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is my favorite author.
Do you prefer physical books or ebooks?
I definitely prefer ebooks. As a software engineer, I always have my devices with me, and it's convenient to switch between different books depending on my mood or needs.
I prefer physical books, especially when reading with my children. There's something special about turning actual pages together and pointing at pictures that you can't replicate with ebooks.
For recipes and cooking, I prefer physical books. They're easier to keep in the kitchen without worrying about spills. But for other reading, I use ebooks, especially when traveling.
I like both formats for different reasons. Physical books are better for design references because I can appreciate the print quality, but ebooks are great for reading on my commute.
Physical books are my preference when I'm home, but when I'm leading tours, ebooks are much more practical. I can't carry many books in my backpack.
I prefer ebooks for my academic reading because they're searchable and I can easily highlight important passages. But for leisure reading, I love the feel of physical books.
How often do you find time to read?
I try to read at least an hour every day, usually during my lunch break and before bed. Working in tech means I spend a lot of time in front of screens, so I've made it a habit to read during my breaks to rest my eyes. I also join online reading challenges to stay motivated. Right now I'm trying to read 30 books this year.
As a mother and teacher, I've learned to make reading part of our daily routine. I read with my children for about 30 minutes every evening before bedtime, and I dedicate early morning hours, usually around 5:30 a.m., for my professional reading. Weekends are my time for personal reading. I can usually get in a few hours while the kids are at their activities.
In my profession, timing is quite unique. I actually do most of my reading during my afternoon breaks between lunch and dinner service, probably about 2 hours total. Late at night after my shift, I usually spend another hour reading to unwind. Mondays, when the restaurant is closed, are my big reading days.
My reading routine is quite structured. I read during my hour-long train commute every day, which gives me about 10 hours of reading time per week. I also dedicate Sunday mornings to reading design magazines and art books at my favorite cafe in Shibuya. It's become such a pleasant ritual that I look forward to all week. Sometimes I even sketch while reading, especially when I find inspiring design elements.
My reading schedule varies with the tourist seasons. During peak season, I mainly read in the evenings after tours, maybe an hour or two. But in the off-season, I probably read about 4 hours daily. Winter is my prime reading time. I use it to research new locations and historical facts for my tours. I also love reading by the fire in mountain lodges after a day of hiking.
Being a university student means my reading time is quite varied. During term time, I spend about 4 hours daily reading academic materials, but I always reserve at least an hour before bed for pleasure reading. During breaks, I probably read about 5 hours a day. I love finding a quiet spot in the botanical gardens on campus and spending the whole afternoon there with a good book.
Do you like to discuss books with others?
Yes, I actually started a small book club with other developers at my company. We mainly discuss tech books, but it's become a great way to practice English and share different perspectives. It's interesting because we often end up discussing how concepts from books could apply to our current projects. I also participate in some online forums about sci-fi literature.
Absolutely. I run a small reading circle for other ESL teachers where we discuss both teaching methodologies and children's literature. It's incredibly helpful for discovering new books to use in class. At home, I love discussing stories with my children. It's amazing to see how their interpretations differ from mine and how they connect books to their bilingual experiences.
Yes, I'm quite passionate about discussing books, especially with other chefs. We have this informal book exchange at work where we share our favorite cookbooks and food memoirs. It's fascinating because everyone brings their cultural perspective. My sous chef from Thailand recently introduced me to some amazing books about Asian cooking techniques that I wouldn't have discovered otherwise.
I'm actually part of 2 book clubs, one in Japanese with my college friends where we read design theory books, and another in English with other expat creatives in Tokyo. The English book club has really pushed me out of my comfort zone. We often read books about art movements and contemporary design, and discussing these topics in English has helped me articulate my creative ideas better. Plus, it's fascinating to hear how different cultures interpret design principles differently.
Oh yes, discussing books is actually a big part of my job. I often share interesting stories from books with my tour groups. It makes the locations come alive for them. I'm also part of an online community of tour guides where we recommend books about different regions and cultures. It's incredible how a good book can help you see a familiar place in a completely new light. Last month, we had a fascinating discussion about different books covering the Balkan region.
Definitely. I'm very active in my university's environmental science book club, where we discuss both academic texts and environmental literature. It's fascinating because we have students from different countries, so we often compare environmental challenges and solutions from various perspectives. I also run a small online book club focused on African literature and environmental writing. We recently had an amazing discussion about how traditional African storytelling addresses environmental conservation.
What was your favorite book when you were a child?
The Journey to the West was my absolute favorite. I had this beautifully illustrated version that my grandmother gave me. I must have read it at least 10 times. It's fascinating now to see how this classic Chinese story has influenced modern science fiction and fantasy, which I currently enjoy reading in English.
My favorite was Le Petit Prince, in French. I first read it in primary school, and now I'm reading it with my own children in French, Arabic, and English. It's beautiful to see how the story's magic transcends languages. I still have my old copy with my childhood drawings in the margins.
There was this Brazilian children's cookbook called Brincando de Cozinhar, Playing at Cooking, that I absolutely adored. It had simple recipes with colorful illustrations, and my mother and I would cook from it every weekend. Looking back, that book probably sparked my interest in becoming a chef. I still have it in my professional kitchen as a reminder of where my culinary journey began.
I absolutely loved Guri to Gura, a Japanese children's series about two cooking mice. The illustrations were so charming that they actually inspired me to start drawing. I still reference those books sometimes in my design work. There's something about their simple yet expressive style that really resonates with me. I recently bought the English translation to understand how certain Japanese concepts were adapted.
My favorite childhood book was Kaketse ne Hudi Poti, a Slovenian alpine adventure story. It's about a brave young boy who has adventures in the mountains. Looking back, it probably influenced my career choice. The descriptions of the alpine landscapes were so vivid that I would spend hours imagining myself in those mountains. Now I actually guide tours through some of the locations mentioned in the book.
My favorite was Tales by Moonlight, a collection of Nigerian folk tales. My grandmother would read it to me in both English and Yoruba, which really helped me appreciate the richness of bilingual storytelling. The stories often featured themes about respecting nature and living in harmony with the environment, which probably sparked my early interest in environmental science. I still have that book, and the environmental messages in those simple stories feel more relevant than ever.
Have you ever given a book as a gift? What was it?
Yes, I recently gave my team members copies of The Pragmatic Programmer in both English and Chinese. I thought it would be helpful for our professional development, but also as a way to bridge the language barrier in our team. Some prefer reading technical concepts in Chinese first, then English, which I totally understand since that's how I started too.
I love giving books as gifts. Last month, I gave my students personalized English storybooks based on their interests. For one student who loves space, I chose 100 Billion Stars. I also recently gave my children a beautiful trilingual picture book series. It has text in Arabic, French, and English, which reflects our family's language journey.
I actually love giving cookbooks as gifts. Last Christmas, I gave my entire kitchen staff copies of The Flavor Bible. It's become our kitchen's reference book. I also recently gave my niece, who's learning English, a bilingual Portuguese-English cookbook for beginners. It's been wonderful seeing her experiment with both cooking and language learning.
Last month, I gave my design team members a beautiful art book about Japanese minimalism. It was both in Japanese and English, which was perfect because our team is quite international. I also recently gave my friend who's interested in Japanese culture a manga series with parallel text in Japanese and English. It's a great way to learn language through visuals.
As a tour guide, I often give books about local history and culture to my regular clients. Recently, I gave a beautifully illustrated book about alpine flora to a group that was particularly interested in our mountain wildflowers. I also love giving travel literature. I gave my nephew Into Thin Air when he started showing interest in mountaineering.
Books are my favorite gifts to give. For Earth Day, I gave my study group copies of Silent Spring. It's a classic environmental text that really influenced my thinking. I also recently gave my younger sister a collection of contemporary African women writers, because I believe it's important to see ourselves represented in literature.
Do you like reading books in different languages?
Definitely. I read in both Chinese and English, though it was challenging at first. I started with technical documentation in English because I had to for work, but now I actually enjoy reading novels in English too. It's interesting to see how certain concepts or jokes are expressed differently in each language. Sometimes I even read the same book in both languages to improve my English skills.
Reading in multiple languages is part of my daily life. I read in Arabic, French, and English regularly. Each language brings its own perspective and way of expressing ideas. When I read teaching methodology books, I prefer English versions because most current research is published in English. For poetry and literature, I often find myself drawn to Arabic and French works.
Yes, I read in Portuguese, English, and I'm starting to read simple texts in Spanish. Each language has its own rich culinary terminology, and sometimes concepts just don't translate exactly. Reading recipes in their original language helps me understand the authentic techniques better. Though I must admit, technical cooking terms in English were quite challenging at first.
Yes, I read in both Japanese and English regularly. Initially, it was challenging to read design books in English, but it's essential in my field since many cutting-edge design concepts are published in English first. I love comparing manga in Japanese and English too. It's fascinating to see how visual storytelling translates across languages, especially how onomatopoeia differs.
Being a tour guide means reading in multiple languages is essential. I read primarily in Slovenian and English, with some German and Italian. Each language offers unique perspectives on our local history and culture. What's particularly interesting is how different languages describe the same locations or historical events. Sometimes you get completely different insights.
Growing up in Nigeria gave me a natural advantage with languages. I read in English, Yoruba, and some French. Environmental science papers are usually in English, but I love reading African literature in both English and Yoruba. The way environmental themes are expressed in different languages can be quite revealing. Some concepts about nature and conservation just feel more powerful in certain languages.
Has your taste in books changed over the years?
Oh, absolutely. When I first started working, I only read programming books and technical manuals. But over the last few years, I've discovered science fiction and popular science books. I think working in tech has made me more curious about future technologies and scientific developments. These days, I'm even trying some classical literature in English. It's challenging but rewarding.
My reading habits have evolved significantly, especially since becoming a mother and teacher. Before, I mainly read fiction and poetry for pleasure. Now, I find myself drawn to educational psychology books, parenting guides, and children's literature. I also read more diverse authors from different cultures to bring various perspectives into my classroom. Recently, I've developed an interest in books about raising multilingual children.
When I was younger, I mostly read fiction and sports magazines. Then as I started my culinary career, I focused almost exclusively on cookbooks and food science texts. Now, I find myself drawn to food anthropology books, culinary memoirs, and books about sustainable cooking practices. I'm also reading more about different cultural food traditions and their histories.
My reading tastes have definitely evolved. In university, I mostly read manga and fashion magazines. Now, I find myself drawn to books about design theory, user experience, and digital art. Recently, I've started reading more about traditional Japanese aesthetics and how they influence modern design. I'm also getting into Western graphic design history. It gives me a different perspective on my work.
My reading interests have broadened significantly over the years. I started with purely adventure and travel books, but now I read extensively about history, geology, local folklore, and even botany. Working with tourists has taught me that people want to know about everything, from the rocks they're climbing on to the legends about the castles they're visiting. I've also developed a keen interest in books about sustainable tourism.
My reading habits have evolved considerably. In secondary school, I mostly read fiction and fashion blogs. When I first started my environmental science degree, I focused heavily on scientific texts and journals. Now, I'm finding a balance. I read academic materials, but I'm also deeply interested in indigenous environmental knowledge and traditional African perspectives on conservation. I've also started reading more climate fiction, sci-fi. It's fascinating to see how authors imagine our environmental future.
How do you choose which books to read next?
I have a pretty systematic approach to choosing books. I maintain a spreadsheet, very engineer-like, I know. I follow several tech blogs and add their recommended books to my list. I also pay attention to what my colleagues are reading. For fiction, I often look for award-winning science fiction, especially books that have been translated from English to Chinese, so I can read them in both languages.
I choose books based on both personal and professional needs. For teaching, I follow several ESL education forums and their recommendations. For my children, I carefully select books that match their language levels and interests. Personally, I love asking other bilingual parents for recommendations about language education and multicultural parenting.
I have a unique way of choosing books. I follow several renowned chefs on social media and note down the books they mention. I also love browsing local bookstores when I travel, looking for regional cookbooks. My sous chef and I have this informal book exchange system where we recommend books to each other based on what techniques or cuisines we're currently exploring.
I have several ways of finding new books. For design books, I follow several design blogs and YouTube channels, both Japanese and international ones. I also subscribe to a few design magazines that review new books. For fiction, I'm part of a Goodreads group for Japanese people learning English. We share recommendations for books that are engaging but not too difficult to read in English.
My book selection is often influenced by my upcoming tours. If I'm planning a new hiking route, I'll read books about that region's history and nature. I also follow several adventure travel blogs that recommend books. During winter, when tourism is slower, I love asking other tour guides across Europe for their favorite books about their regions.
I have a pretty diverse approach to choosing books. For my environmental studies, I follow several scientific journals and their recommended reading lists. For African literature, I'm part of an online book club where we vote on monthly readings. I also love discovering new environmental writers through climate activism networks. Recently, I've started following more Indigenous authors who write about traditional environmental knowledge.
Do you take notes while reading?
Yes, especially for technical books. I use a digital note-taking system where I categorize different coding concepts and solutions. For science fiction, I actually write down interesting English vocabulary and phrases. It's helped me improve my technical English significantly. Sometimes I share these notes with my colleagues who are also learning English.
Absolutely. As a teacher, taking notes is second nature. I use different colored sticky notes, pink for teaching ideas, blue for vocabulary to share with students, and yellow for personal reflections. When reading parenting books, I keep a separate journal to track ideas I want to try with my children. It's like creating my own personal teaching and parenting resource library.
Yes, my cookbooks are full of notes. I use a color coding system. Red for recipe modifications, blue for ingredient substitutions, and green for plating ideas. For books about food history or culture, I keep a digital notebook where I record interesting facts that I can share with my restaurant guests. Sometimes these notes even inspire new menu items.
Being a visual person, my note-taking is quite unique. I keep a sketchbook where I draw elements that inspire me from design books. For English books, I create visual vocabulary maps, like mind maps with small illustrations. When reading digital books, I use different highlight colors: yellow for new English phrases, green for design ideas, and blue for concepts I want to research further.
Yes, I'm quite systematic about note-taking. I use a special guides notebook divided into sections: historical facts, local legends, nature information, and interesting trivia. When I read books in different languages, I note down how certain places are described. Tourists often appreciate hearing these different perspectives. I also sketch small maps and mark interesting locations mentioned in books.
Oh yes, my books are full of notes. For academic reading, I use a digital note-taking system with color-coded highlights: green for key theories, blue for important data, and yellow for potential research ideas. For environmental literature, I keep a journal where I connect different authors' perspectives on climate change. I also note down powerful quotes that I might use in my activism work.
What's your favorite place or time to read?
My favorite reading spot is actually my balcony during early morning hours, around 6 a.m., before the city gets noisy. I have a comfortable chair there, and I often spend weekends reading there with a cup of green tea.
My absolute favorite reading time is early weekend mornings in our family reading nook, a cozy corner we created with cushions and good lighting. I get about 2 hours of peaceful reading before the children wake up. During school days, I often read professional development books during my lunch break in the school library.
Late night after service is my prime reading time, usually between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. I have this comfortable armchair in my home kitchen where I love to sit and read with a glass of wine. On my days off, I enjoy reading at local cafes. There's something inspiring about reading about food while watching people enjoy their meals.
My favorite reading spot is this quiet cafe near my design studio in Daikanyama. It has these huge windows and perfect lighting. I go there every Sunday morning and spend about 3 hours reading and sketching. On weekdays, I read during my train commute. It's actually quite peaceful in Japanese trains since everyone is quiet.
This might sound strange, but my favorite place to read is in mountain huts during tour breaks. There's something magical about reading about a place while being there. During off-season, I love reading by Lake Bled early in the morning. I have this specific bench with a perfect view of the castle. At home, I have a reading corner decorated with maps and travel photographs.
The university's botanical garden is my absolute favorite reading spot. I found this perfect bench under a huge baobab tree. It's quiet and inspiring to read about environmental issues while surrounded by nature. During exam periods, I love studying in the environmental science department's library late at night. At home, I've created a small reading nook with plants and natural light.
Have you ever started a book but couldn't finish it?
Actually, yes. I tried reading Infinite Jest in English because many of my American colleagues recommended it, but the complex language and cultural references were too challenging. I plan to try again in a few years when my English improves. Instead of giving up completely, I've started with shorter contemporary novels to build my confidence.
Yes, I started reading a complex theoretical book about bilingual education, but with 2 young children, I found it hard to concentrate on such dense material. Instead, I switched to a more practical guide with real-life examples. I've learned that sometimes it's better to choose books that match your current life situation.
There was this molecular gastronomy book that I started but couldn't finish because the scientific terminology in English was too advanced. However, I turned it into a learning opportunity. I'm now taking an online course about food science to build my technical vocabulary before trying the book again.
Yes, I tried reading Design Thinking in English when I first started learning the language. The business and design terminology was overwhelming at that time. But rather than giving up completely, I found a Japanese version, read it first, then went back to the English version. Now this has become my strategy for tackling difficult design theory books.
I started reading a detailed geological study of the Alps, but it was too technical for my needs. Instead, I found several books that explain geological concepts in a more accessible way. Now I use these simpler explanations when talking to tourists about our mountain formations. Sometimes you need to know when to switch to something more suitable.
I tried reading a very technical book about climate modeling in my first year, but it was beyond my understanding at that time. I felt quite discouraged, but my professor suggested starting with more basic texts first. Now, 3 years later, I've actually gone back to that book and can understand it much better. It taught me that sometimes the timing needs to be right.
Do you have any reading goals for this year?
I set myself a challenge to read 20 technical books and 10 English novels this year. I'm also trying to read more diverse science fiction, not just American and Chinese authors, but writers from around the world. I keep track of everything on Goodreads, which helps me stay motivated. So far, I'm about 60% through my goal.
This year, I'm aiming to read 24 children's books in English to review for my classes, 12 professional development books about teaching, and at least 6 books about raising multilingual children. I'm also challenging myself to read 1 English novel each month. It helps me recommend books to my advanced students.
My main goal this year is to read 1 book each month about a cuisine I'm not familiar with. So far, I've covered Ethiopian, Korean, and Persian cooking. I'm also trying to read more about sustainable food practices and zero-waste cooking. I keep a blog in English where I review these books, which helps me practice my writing.
I've set myself several reading goals this year. I want to read 12 major design publications in English, explore at least 15 art books from different cultures, and finish one English novel every month. I'm also challenging myself to read more about traditional Japanese design principles. I think it's important to understand our design heritage while working in modern design.
This year, I'm trying to read histories of all the major regions I guide in. That's about 15 books. I'm also working through a list of environmental conservation books because more tourists are asking about climate change's impact on our mountains. Plus, I'm trying to improve my Italian by reading at least one Italian guidebook each month.
My reading goals are quite ambitious this year. I aim to read 30 academic papers about environmental conservation, 12 books about traditional African environmental practices, and at least 20 articles about current climate initiatives. I'm also challenging myself to read more environmental literature from other developing nations to compare their experiences with ours.
What was the last book you recommended to someone?
Last week, I recommended The Phoenix Project to my team. It's about IT management but written like a novel, which makes it really engaging. I thought it would help them understand our department's challenges better. I even created a small study group where we discuss one chapter each week in English.
I recently recommended The Reading Promise to my parent-teacher group. It's about a father who read to his daughter every night for 9 years. It really inspired some parents to start reading routines with their children. I even created a reading challenge for my students' families based on this book.
I just recommended Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat to my entire kitchen team. It's perfect because it explains cooking science in a very accessible way, and the illustrations make it easy to understand even if your English isn't perfect. We've started discussing different chapters during our pre-service meetings.
Just last week, I recommended Ways of Seeing by John Berger to my junior designers. Even though it's an older book, its insights about visual culture are still relevant today. I also created a small visual guide translating some key concepts into Japanese to help them understand the more complex parts.
I recently recommended The Hidden Life of Trees to a group after they asked many questions during our forest tour. It perfectly explains complex ecological concepts in an engaging way. Several tourists have emailed me saying they bought it after the tour and now see forests differently.
Last month, I recommended Braiding Sweetgrass to my entire environmental science study group. It beautifully combines scientific knowledge with indigenous wisdom about nature. It's generated some fascinating discussions about how we can integrate traditional Nigerian environmental practices into modern conservation efforts.
How has reading helped you in your career or studies?
Reading has been absolutely crucial for my career in tech. When I first started, I had to read a lot of English documentation and Stack Overflow posts. But beyond technical reading, books about software architecture and clean coding have shaped how I approach problem solving. I recently led a project refactoring our code base, and I directly applied principles from books I'd read about software design patterns.
Reading has transformed both my teaching and parenting approaches. Education journals have given me new teaching strategies, while parenting books have helped me understand how to support bilingual development. Recently, I created a new reading program for my students based on techniques I learned from various teaching methodology books.
Reading has opened so many doors in my culinary career. Through books, I've learned about cuisines I haven't had the chance to experience firsthand yet. Professional kitchen management books helped me when I became head chef, and reading food science books has improved my understanding of cooking techniques. Last month, I completely revised our menu based on ideas from various cookbooks.
Reading has been fundamental to keeping up with design trends and developing my own style. Design books in English have given me access to global perspectives that aren't always available in Japanese. Last year, I redesigned our company's branding based on principles I learned from various typography books. Reading about user experience design has also helped me create more accessible designs for international clients.
Reading has completely transformed my tour guiding. History books have given me fascinating stories to share, while geology books help me explain our landscape features. Recently, I read several books about local folklore, and my tours became much more engaging when I incorporated these stories. Reading in multiple languages has also helped me connect better with international tourists.
Reading has been essential for my environmental science studies and activism. Academic papers keep me updated on climate research, while books about environmental movements have shaped my approach to advocacy. Last semester, I used concepts from various conservation books to develop a community recycling project. Reading has also helped me understand how environmental issues affect different communities globally.
Do you remember the first book you read in English?
Yes, it was Alice in Programming Land, a programming book that used Alice in Wonderland as a metaphor for coding concepts. I chose it because I knew the story in Chinese, which helped me understand the English version. Though I had to look up many words, it made learning programming terms more fun and memorable.
My first English book was Matilda by Roald Dahl. I was already teaching basic English then, but reading a full novel was daunting. I chose it because I wanted to recommend English books to my students. It took me 3 months to finish, but it gave me so much confidence. Now I use excerpts from it in my classes.
My first English book was Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain. I struggled with it at first, but my passion for cooking kept me motivated. I kept a notebook of cooking terms I didn't know, and now I use that same notebook to teach English kitchen vocabulary to my junior chefs.
The first English book I read completely was The Elements of Typographic Style. I chose it because it had lots of visual examples, which helped me understand the text. It took me almost 6 months, and I made a visual dictionary of design terms, but it was worth it. That book actually helped me win my first international client because I could discuss design concepts in English.
My first English book was Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. I chose it because it combined my love of mountains with my desire to learn English. Though challenging, the familiar mountaineering terms helped me understand the context. Now I recommend it to all my adventure tourism colleagues who are learning English.
My first full English book was Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Though I grew up speaking English, reading literature was different from conversational English. This book was special because it bridged my Nigerian heritage with English literature. Now I often reference it when discussing how environmental changes affect traditional communities.
How do you make time for reading despite your busy schedule?
I've turned it into a daily habit by linking it to my routines. Every morning, I read technical articles during my breakfast, and I always read for 30 minutes during lunch break. On my commute, I listen to audiobooks, especially software engineering podcasts. Weekends are for longer reading sessions. I usually spend Sunday mornings at a quiet cafe with a programming book.
I've incorporated reading into our family routine. When my children do their homework, I read my professional development books. I wake up an hour before everyone else to read in peace, and I always carry an e-book on my phone for unexpected free moments. During school breaks, I dedicate 2 hours every morning to reading teaching methodology books.
Working in a restaurant means unusual hours, so I've adapted my reading schedule. I read digital cookbooks on my phone during prep time, and I always read for an hour after service ends. It helps me unwind. Sunday mornings are sacred for reading physical cookbooks and planning new menu items. I also listen to culinary audiobooks while commuting.
I've turned my commute into reading time. It's about 45 minutes each way on the train. I also have what I call my Sunday design ritual, where I spend 3 hours at my favorite cafe reading design magazines and books. During lunch breaks, I read design blogs on my tablet, and I always carry an ebook for whenever I'm waiting for clients.
My reading schedule changes with the tourism seasons. During peak season, I read early in the morning before tours begin, usually from 6 to 7 a.m. During off-season, I spend about 4 hours daily reading and researching. I also use winter evenings to catch up on my reading list. When I'm leading multi-day tours, I always bring an e-reader for the evenings at mountain lodges.
I've developed a strict reading schedule around my university timetable. I read academic papers early in the morning when my mind is fresh, usually from 5:30 to 7 a.m. Between lectures, I read environmental news on my phone, and I dedicate Sunday afternoons to reading environmental literature. During exam periods, I join study groups where we discuss environmental science texts together.
Have you ever read a book that changed your perspective on life?
Mindset by Carol Dweck really changed how I view learning and challenges. As a programmer, I used to get frustrated when facing difficult problems. This book taught me to see challenges as opportunities for growth. Now I approach debugging and learning new programming languages with a completely different attitude. It's actually helped me mentor junior developers better too.
The bilingual Brian completely changed my approach to teaching and raising bilingual children. It helped me understand that language mixing is natural and not something to worry about. This knowledge has made me more confident in both my teaching methods and my children's language development.
The Omnivore's Dilemma completely changed how I think about food sourcing and menu planning. After reading it, I started working more closely with local farmers and revised our restaurant's supply chain. It also inspired me to start our restaurant's small herb garden and composting program.
I really enjoy the Layout Workbook series by Kristen Cullen. Each book focuses on different aspects of design principles, from typography to color theory. The series is especially meaningful to me because it helped me bridge the gap between Japanese and Western design approaches. I often refer back to them when working on international projects.
The Hidden Life of Trees completely changed how I conduct forest tours. Before, I just focused on identifying trees and plants, but this book taught me about the complex relationships in forest ecosystems. Now I help tourists understand forests as communities rather than just collections of individual trees.
The Great Green Wall completely shifted my perspective on environmental solutions. It showed me how traditional African approaches to conservation can be combined with modern environmental science. This book inspired my current research project about indigenous conservation practices in Nigeria.
Do you have a favorite book series?
I love the Three-Body Problem series by Lou Sixon. As a software engineer, I appreciate how it combines hard science with imaginative storytelling. I first read it in Chinese, then in English, which was fascinating because some technical concepts were expressed differently. It's also special to me because it shows Chinese science fiction can be globally successful.
The Magic School Bus series is my favorite, both personally and professionally. I use them in my classes because they combine science education with language learning. The illustrations help students understand new vocabulary, and the stories are engaging. I've collected both the English and Arabic versions.
I love the River Cottage cookbook series by Hugh Fernley Whittingstall. Each book explores different aspects of sustainable cooking and seasonal ingredients. The series helped me develop my philosophy about using local ingredients and reducing food waste. I've read each book multiple times, making notes about how to adapt the concepts to Brazilian ingredients.
I really enjoy the Layout Workbook series by Kristen Cullen. Each book focuses on different aspects of design principles, from typography to color theory. The series is especially meaningful to me because it helped me bridge the gap between Japanese and Western design approaches. I often refer back to them when working on international projects.
I love Bill Bryson's travel series, especially A Walk in the Woods and In a Sunburned Country. His writing combines humor with detailed historical and scientific information, exactly what I aim for in my tours. These books taught me how to make educational content entertaining, which has greatly improved my guiding style.
I'm passionate about the Green Africa series by various African environmentalists. Each book explores environmental challenges and solutions from different African perspectives. What makes this series special is how it combines scientific data with traditional ecological knowledge. I've used many concepts from these books in my environmental activism.
What do you think about book adaptations, movies, TV shows?
I have mixed feelings. As a tech person, I understand that different platforms require different approaches. I enjoyed the Ready Player One adaptation because it captured the essence of the tech world, even though it was different from the book. However, I often find that movies simplify the complex technical aspects that make books interesting.
As a teacher, I find adaptations can be valuable learning tools. When my students read a book and then watch the adaptation, it helps reinforce their understanding. We often compare and contrast the two versions in class, which leads to great discussions about storytelling in different media. Though I usually prefer the books, adaptations can make literature more accessible to language learners.
I find cooking show adaptations of cookbooks fascinating, especially when they show techniques that are hard to understand from text alone. However, I've noticed that TV shows often oversimplify complex cooking processes. As a chef, I prefer the detailed explanations in books, but I understand that visual demonstrations can be helpful for home cooks.
As a graphic designer, I'm fascinated by how books are adapted into visual media. I pay special attention to how they translate descriptive passages into visual elements. Recently, I watched the adaptation of Norwegian Wood. It was interesting to see how they captured Murakami's symbolic imagery. Though I usually prefer books, I appreciate how adaptations can bring new perspectives to familiar stories.
As a tour guide, I find adaptations interesting because they often showcase locations I'm familiar with. When The Chronicles of Narnia was filmed partly in Slovenia, it brought new tourists interested in seeing the filming locations. However, I always encourage people to read the books too, as they often contain richer historical and cultural details that films can't include.
I find documentary adaptations of environmental books particularly powerful. When I watched the adaptation of Silent Spring, seeing the visual evidence of environmental damage had a different impact than reading about it. However, I think the books usually provide more detailed scientific explanations and solutions. Recently, I've started a campus club where we read environmental books and watch their adaptations to compare their effectiveness in conveying environmental messages.
What book would you like to read next?
I'm planning to read AI 2041, 10 Visions for Our Future. It combines two of my interests, artificial intelligence and science fiction. Since it was co-written by a Chinese author, I'm excited to see how they envision the future of AI from both Eastern and Western perspectives.
I'm looking forward to reading Translanguaging in Education. As a teacher and mother raising bilingual children, I'm always interested in new approaches to multilingual education. I think it could give me fresh ideas for both my classroom and home.
I'm eager to start reading Gastro Obscura, a food adventurer's guide. It explores unique and lesser-known food traditions from around the world. As a chef, I'm always looking for inspiration, and I think this book might give me ideas for fusion dishes that combine Brazilian cuisine with other culinary traditions.
I'm planning to read Japanese Design, Art, Aesthetics and Culture next. Even though I'm Japanese, I'm interested in reading about our design principles from an international perspective. It might help me better explain Japanese aesthetic concepts to my Western clients.
I'm about to start The Last Wild Places of Slovenia. It combines nature photography with environmental conservation information. As a tour guide, I'm always looking for new perspectives on our natural heritage to share with visitors.
I'm excited to start reading Indigenous Environmental Justice. It examines how different indigenous communities worldwide approach environmental conservation. I think it will help me better understand how to integrate traditional Nigerian environmental practices into modern conservation efforts.
What advice would you give to someone who wants to start reading more?
Start with something close to your interests. When I began reading in English, I started with programming blogs, then short technical articles before moving to books. Also, don't feel pressured to finish every book. It's okay to switch if something isn't working for you.
Start with small goals. maybe 15 minutes before bed. As a busy mother and teacher, I've learned that consistency matters more than quantity. Also, always carry a book or e-reader with you. You'd be surprised how many short reading opportunities you can find throughout the day.
From my experience, treat reading like trying a new cuisine. Start with what looks interesting to you. Don't force yourself to read important books if they don't excite you. I started with simple cooking blogs and worked my way up to more complex culinary literature. Also, join a reading community. My kitchen book club keeps me motivated.
As a designer, I suggest treating books like visual art. Find ones that appeal to you visually at first. Maybe start with illustrated books or magazines in your field. I also recommend creating a comfortable reading space with good lighting. Environment really affects the reading experience.
I'd say start with stories about places or topics you love. Don't worry about reading speed. Some of my best insights come from slow, careful reading. Also, try reading about places you're planning to visit. It makes both the reading and the travel more meaningful.
I'd say connect your reading to your passions. If you care about climate change, start with environmental books that address your specific concerns. Also, create a reading circle with friends. We discuss one environmental book each month, which keeps us accountable and provides different perspectives.
If you could write a book, what would it be about?
I'd love to write a bilingual guide for Chinese developers learning to work with English documentation. From my experience, there's a real need for this. I'd include common technical terms, cultural differences in coding practices, and tips for participating in international open-source projects.
I'd write a guide for parents raising multilingual children in Morocco, combining my personal experience with teaching expertise. It would include practical activities, common challenges, and success stories from other families. I think many parents here could benefit from such a resource.
I'd write a book about the evolution of Brazilian cuisine, focusing on how different cultural influences have shaped our food. I'd include traditional recipes with modern twists, and stories from local producers and farmers. It would be bilingual, in Portuguese and English, to help preserve our culinary heritage while making it accessible to international readers.
I'd love to create a visual book about the intersection of traditional Japanese design principles and modern digital design. It would include case studies from my work, showing how concepts like negative space can be applied to website design. I'd make it highly visual with lots of examples and illustrations.
I would write an insider's guide to the hidden gems of Slovenia's Alpine region. Not just the tourist spots, but the secret trails, local legends, and seasonal changes that only experienced guides know about. I'd include environmental conservation tips and ways to experience nature responsibly.
I'd write a book about young African environmentalists who are combining traditional knowledge with modern science to address climate change. It would showcase innovative projects across the continent and provide a blueprint for sustainable development that respects both nature and cultural heritage.
That's all for today's daily English Room conversation practice. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this video, like, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. See you next time.